Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to Fathom, a podcast where we attempt to understand the higher and deeper truth, and in so doing, enrich our mind and soul. I'm Davud Sudagar, and the topic of this episode is this Trump's war? So the first episode of our podcast is coming out against the backdrop of the war waged by the U.S., the Israeli regime, and their regional allies against Iran. This is an inflection point in the history of the world. This war will change the world for the better. There is no doubt in my mind that Iran will emerge victorious and that this war will expedite the downward trajectory that the United States has been on for several decades now. For this reason, in this first episode of Fathom, we will consider the current war on Iran and try to shed some light on its true nature. This episode is based on an article I've written by the same title, which you can find on my blog, ddsthoughtsandmusings.blogspot.com, and also on my Substack page, ddsodagar.substack.com. You can find the links in the show notes. One of the biggest falsehoods peddled by the media empire is the line that the current war against Iran is Trump's war, quote-unquote Trump's war. In fact, however, the war, which has now lasted more than a month, is a war waged by the U.S., not by Trump or the Trump administration, but by the United States of America. That is, it is the U.S. establishment, with a capital E, the U.S. establishment that initiated the war. The U.S. establishment, we need to understand, is an amorphous political entity run by the highly secretive and heavily masked deep state. Now, I'm not a crazy lunatic obsessed with wacky conspiracy theories. This premise about the deep state is an indubitable fact supported by a large body of incontrovertible evidentiary facts. So, basically, what we need to bear in mind and take as a given for the time being is that the U.S. establishment is an amorphous and secretive entity. Congress, the White House, the CIA, the FBI, and so on and so forth are the limbs and tentacles of this entity. The establishment is the substrate, if you will, within which these governmental bodies and organizations operate. Now, to get an understanding of how the establishment works, and this bears on how this war unfolded and where it's going, I'm going to touch on some very obvious historical cases, and then I'll turn to the current war on Iran. Let's go back a couple of decades. So when George W. Bush started the Second Persian Gulf War, let us recall, most of the major left-leaning news outlets did everything in their power, despite their apparent opposition to the Bush administration. They did everything in their power to shore up political support for that illegal invasion of a faraway country. The fictitious justification provided by the Bush administration was left largely unchallenged. And only when the blunders of the campaign began coming to light did pundits and political players, mostly on the left, start questioning the logic and prosecution of the war. Once this misguided hostile enterprise started going south, critical voices jumped on the anti-war bandwagon, denouncing it as a disaster brought on by the neocons. Nevertheless, the next president of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, while decrying the warmongering of the neocon hawks, in essence continued the same militaristic, interventionist policy, albeit, and this is very critical, with a different tone. While Obama began scaling back the U.S. presence in Iraq, he had no qualms increasing the footprint of the U.S. military in Afghanistan. Now, let's jump ahead several years to Trump's first administration and consider another blatant example that demonstrates the consistency of the U.S. foreign policy across different administrations. One of the most strategically significant foreign policy approaches adopted by Trump 1.0 was his belligerent stance toward China. The upshot of this approach was a tariff regime that upended the trade relationship between the two top world powers. Now, what did the Biden administration do when it took the White House? Biden and Trump were represented by the media empire as two polar opposites. They were as far apart on their perceptions of U.S. domestic and foreign policies as was possible. Yet, Biden, crucially, retained the anti-China tariff regime largely intact. And the same bipartisan consistency in foreign policy is evident on such key foreign issues as hostility toward Iran, intense rivalry with China, and support for Israel. No one in either political party earnestly challenges these policy approaches. And these are only a few of the most salient examples. Now let's consider a more recent development. So another telling instance of this bipartisan consistency I'm talking about is the loud and rambunctious electoral campaign orchestrated by Zohran Mamdani, hailed by some as the first Shia mayor in the U.S. As a self-styled democratic socialist, Mamdani was portrayed as the antithesis of Trump. He repeatedly lashed out at Trump, who did not shy away from returning every slight with equal force. There were members of the Shia community who celebrated this pivotal point in American history. The fact that an American of Indian descent, born in Africa, could rise to the top echelons of the political elite was proof that American democracy, though flawed, was essentially sound. When asked at the time what I thought of Mamdani's electoral win, I was unequivocal. To run for mayor of a major U.S. city, I explained, one has to be a member of the establishment and in alignment with the deep state. No matter what radical labels one wears or what political affiliations one flaunts, you need to be plugged, so to speak, into the establishment. Not too long after Mamdani's electoral victory, a slight glimpse of the truth emerged. After winning the election, Mamdani significantly toned down his antagonism against his archfoe Trump, so much so that he went to the White House and sat with the president for a surprisingly, quote-unquote, productive meeting. Regardless of how bitterly they seem to fight, Democrats and Republicans are on the same team. This was highlighted inadvertently, I think, by a well-regarded expert interviewed by Ezra Klein, the renowned New York Times columnist and podcaster. In an episode entitled The Architecture of Jeffrey Epstein's Power, which of course, not surprisingly, largely papers over the real nature of the network centered around Epstein, reducing it to a ring of perverts, Ezra Klein's guest remarks, and I'm quoting here, "This diversity," by which he means diversity between politicians with different political affiliations, this diversity masks a deeper solidarity. If you're sitting at home watching cable and you're seeing the two talking heads fight, that's the spectacle for you at home to keep you entertained. What they're actually doing, that is, in the real world, when we're not watching, what they're actually doing is revealed in these files, by which he means the Epstein files. And what is it they're doing in the real world? It's hanging out, breaking bread, colluding, sharing information, giving each other tips on deals, giving each other public relations advice, making introductions to each other. This was a snippet of the truth that was revealed in a podcast hosted by Ezra Klein. In other words, what Klein's guest is trying to say is that the Epstein debacle is a rare glimpse into how individuals with ostensibly vast political differences are actually doing. They're actually members of the same system, playing the same game. Republicans and Democrats, and even putative political outcasts such as Noam Chomsky, are all fundamentally on the same page. And there are a lot of examples supporting this premise, going back to the early years of the United States. It's not something new. Thing is, you just need to connect the dots. Let's take a short break. I'll be back shortly. We're back. You're listening to Fathom, and I'm Davut Sudegar. So bearing in mind the background I laid out before the break, it is crucial to understand that Trump was, quote-unquote, elected, which actually means appointed by the deep state, to fulfill a specific mission. A mission that fits, and this is very important, a mission that fits his character and demeanor. Trump's second administration came at a time when U.S. power, which has been on the decline for decades, was at a historic low. In an opinion piece for the New York Times entitled, "The U.S. is no longer the leader of the free world," Carlos Lozada addresses this very topic. Though overlooking significant truths, which leads him to draw, in my view, a flawed conclusion, nevertheless, he underscores some very intriguing insights in this relation. So I would encourage you to go and read that article. Pretty insightful. So based on this article and other historical sources, and I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but one could say that contrary to the common perception, the early 1970s saw the peak of American power, which then plateaued for a decade or two and afterward began a steady decline that has only accelerated in the last couple of decades. The U.S. is now facing a situation similar in a number of important respects, but not in every respect, to the period leading up to the Second World War. Despite all appearances, the U.S. economy is in tatters. The national debt crisis is looming ever more ominously. To extricate the U.S. from the social, political, and economic quagmire in which it is sinking deeper and deeper, the establishment had no choice but to disrupt the business-as-usual order of things and engineer an exit that would somehow or other unburden it of all the accumulated woes that threaten to destabilize and even unravel the United States of America. This is the task the establishment has entrusted to Trump, whether he knows it or not. He's just an instrument, an avatar, if you will. Let's remember that Trump came to power as a president of peace. That's a label that he would, or at least his fans, his devotees, would use about him. He vowed to put an end to the interventionist foreign policy that has dominated U.S. politics since the Second World War. Yet no sooner had he entered the presidential office than he started making threats against U.S. adversaries as well as U.S. allies. Trump, who in his first administration was reviled by critics on the left as an admirer of Putin, adopted a starkly antagonistic stance toward Russia in his second administration. And I'm mainly referring to real policy actions, notwithstanding Trump's sometimes flattering rhetoric for Putin. Moreover, only a few months into his second presidency, he agreed, to the chagrin of some of his staunchest far-right supporters, to join Israel in its war in Iran. A few months thereafter, he mounted an escalating campaign of gunboat diplomacy against Venezuela that culminated in a special operation in which the U.S. military apprehended the Venezuelan president. Of course, there's a great deal hidden from the public regarding how the U.S. actually managed to carry out this military campaign so unbelievably successfully. And now here we are, just over a year into his second term, and the isolationist president of peace has launched, in violation of one of his main election promises, another war against Iran. Is this a coincidence? Of course not. There is a great deal of speculation about the rationale for this war. Trump's Zionist supporters are hailing this war as legitimate and even necessary. Trump's detractors, both on the left and the right, are criticizing the lack of strategic transparency regarding the war's objectives. Yet, curiously enough, even his critics agree that Iran had this war coming. Even the news outlets most vehemently opposed to Trump, like NPR, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, etc., They are all in agreement regarding the evil nature of the Iranian regime and the moral and even legal legitimacy of overthrowing it. There is an idiom in the English language which I find quite interesting: damning someone with faint praise. Damning someone with faint praise. But the converse notion does not have a commonly accepted idiom. Therefore, I would like to take the liberty of suggesting a potential phraseology of my own. I'm making this up, but I think it captures what I'm trying to say here. The opposite notion one could phrase as validating someone with lousy criticism. And this is precisely what Trump's critics on the left are deliberately engaging in. Not coincidentally, not haphazardly, but based on a clear plan drafted for them by the deep state. These left-leaning critics of Trump, quote-unquote critics of Trump, portray the U.S. military in a very positive light, exaggerating its successes and underreporting and censoring the efficacy of Iran's attacks on U.S. military bases in the region and on sensitive Israeli targets. Iranian missile attacks on Israel are downplayed as largely ineffective, mostly neutralized by the Israeli air defense system. No major left-wing news outlet has, for instance, done any notable reporting on why the 2 U.S. aircraft carriers sent to the region retreated, fleeing to the safety of distant waters. Now, of course, we know from Iranian sources that the USS Abraham Lincoln was repeatedly attacked by Iranian missiles and drones, as a result of which it incurred significant damage. The USS Gerald Ford also aborted its mission prematurely due to some supposedly non-combat related problems. Moreover, left-leaning news outlets, which depict themselves as opposing Trump on nearly everything he stands for, echo the same false talking points promoted by him and his administration against the Islamic Republic of Iran. They denounce the Iranian government as the most nefarious state sponsor of terrorism and an evil regime that in the last couple of months alone has massacred over 40,000 of its citizens. A regime that is loathed by 80% of its population, a regime that suffers from insanely high levels of mismanagement to such an extent that it is incapable of providing basic services to the Iranian people. These left-leaning news outlets make no attempt, despite priding themselves on their journalistic independence and impartiality, at considering the validity of these preposterous claims. It never occurs to them, for instance, to ask how a quote-unquote regime that has such minuscule public support and such a weak military capability is able to withstand this sudden elimination of its top brass and to mount an effective and prolonged counteroffensive against the fiercest assault launched in the last several decades by the world's mightiest military, to say nothing of its ability to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed in spite of Trump's repeated assertions that Iran's armed forces have been decimated. Just an average degree of common sense is enough to realize the absurdity of these claims. So you see, the news outlets on the left are actually in sync with the Trump administration on all these points. What they question as a way to maintain the appearance of independence and impartiality is why, for instance, the Trump administration failed to explicitly express its rationale for attacking Iran, or they criticize the administration for its failure to consult with its allies before launching the war, despite ample reporting that Israel, as well as Arab and European countries, had been given heads up about the impending attack. In other words, they refrain from questioning the basic premises undergirding the U.S. war on Iran. Instead, they vociferously rail against the Trump administration over secondary and trivial matters to maintain the appearance of independent and critical journalism. This is the crux of my argument. These critics of Trump, they refrain from questioning the basic premises undergirding the U.S. war in Iran. What they do instead, to maintain a facade of impartiality and independence, is to press the administration on insignificant matters. That is what we need to bear in mind. Based on what I've laid out so far, and I've just scratched the surface, there's a lot more one could say. Based on these few instances, on these few historical instances I've invoked, what becomes clear is that the left-right dichotomy in American politics is a farce. It is merely a performance, albeit, of course, a smart performance that relies on a convoluted and multi-layered infrastructure of deception that is very difficult to see through. If you carefully examine the talking points on the left and the right, what comes to light is that Democrats and Republicans are all in agreement on all major substantive issues. Let me say that again. The Democrats and Republicans are in agreement on all major substantive issues. Their disagreements all boil down to rhetoric, tactics, and minor substantive issues. That is, issues that are not essential to the integrity of the establishment. And in fact, sometimes one will be hard-pressed to even find minor substantive differences. The Democratic-Republican duopoly is the facade that masks the infrastructure of deception that constitutes the foundations of the U.S. establishment. This facade, however, has been fracturing, and it's been fracturing at an accelerating pace in recent years. The cracks are widening for a variety of reasons which I cannot delve into here. And it is to preserve the integrity of this structure that, as in the period leading up to the Second World War, the U.S. had to initiate a war. This wasn't something Trump came up with. To save itself, to pull itself out of the quagmire that it was sinking into, the U.S. had to initiate a war. The war that the U.S. and Israel waged on Iran was planned and executed by the establishment. Trump is merely the most suitable instrument at hand for implementing the wishes of the U.S. establishment. What Trump, a proudly egotistical, erratic, transactional, and opportunistic character, is tasked with is to be the face of this war. Once the war is completed, the majority of the benefits will accrue to the U.S. establishment, supposing, of course, that the U.S. succeeds, and I'm certain it will not. But if it does succeed, the majority of the benefits will accrue to the U.S. establishment, and all the dirty work will be blamed on Trump, as with the tariff regime put in place by Trump, which was then retained by the Biden administration, or the sanctions regime imposed by the administration of George W. Bush in Iran, which was maintained and reinforced by all subsequent administrations. The positive outcomes of this war, should it be successful, will be welcomed and preserved by all subsequent administrations, even if very quietly. But the blame for the atrocities and crimes of the war will conveniently be pinned on Trump and the Trump administration. And if the war fails, and I'm certain it will, the establishment will place all the blame on the Trump administration's lack of clear objectives and strategic transparency while trying to manipulate the resulting disarray in the global order to its own advantage. This, therefore, is not Trump's war in Iran, as the news outlets on the left are keen to portray it. It is the U.S. war on Iran. And as with all previous plots orchestrated by the U.S. against Iran, this war, too, will prove counterproductive. It will only strengthen Iran, elevating it to the status of a major world power while exacerbating the overwhelming woes that afflict the U.S. As a result of this war, the U.S. will lose its decades-long status as the unrivaled global superpower. and it will be relegated to the rank of a secondary power. In fact, in time, the U.S., as a result of this war, the U.S. may even cease to exist in its current form. As God has promised in the Holy Scripture, in the Noble Quran, Surah Al-Imran, they scheme and God schemes, and God is the best of schemers. Thank you for listening to Fathom. I would really appreciate it if you would spread the word about this podcast. And also, please submit any questions or suggestions you may have. If there are any topics that you are interested in or think we should address, do not hesitate to share them with us. Thank you very much. God bless you. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجهم.